Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. I am your host, Dr. Anthony Palomba. And as you can see here, we've done a few changes here, trying to dress up the setting and surrounding set, for that matter, a little bit better. So as you can see, with 4 subscribers and about 60 views per video, we can afford this now. So this is where we are right now. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today we're going to be talking about research methods, but before you change anything, hear me out. It's actually kind of fun doing research. Some of you are probably already snickering and thinking to yourself, well, I've done research before. I hated it. I had to write this paper. I had an awful, boring teacher who seemed to not have a life in or outside of the classroom, and I had to listen to this guy and figure out how to write a paper. But with research methods, especially at the college level, it's a little bit different. What makes research so exciting is that you're looking at something different. You're doing an investigation in something that you really, really like. For instance, for me, as a college professor, I'm constantly doing research on video games, film, and television. I look at the consumer behavior, branding, and marketing behind video games, TV, and film. So I look about how people play video games, or why people play video games, or the brand personalities behind a video game console, or what drives people to go watch a movie in a movie theater instead of watching it on a laptop, or a tablet, or smartphone. There are many, many different methods that we use to try to figure this out. So let's look at the first slide and get into this discussion. So today we're primarily going to be focused on qualitative audience analysis. Now, qualitative audience analysis, you can notice that there's a qual in the first word. Qualitative is related to quality. So with qualitative, we're trying to qualify the kind of research that we're doing here. This means that we're primarily looking at words, and we're looking to create themes and pull themes from text or the spoken word. This means that, for instance, if we were doing a qualitative analysis of a TV script, we might in fact code the entire script of a Seinfeld episode or of a Friends season and say, okay, how many times does this theme come up? Or how many times is drugs spoken about, or sex spoken about, or particular words that are used? Another way that we do qualitative research is primarily through focus groups and in-depth interviews. That'll be the bulk of what we'll talk about today. Now, a focus group deals with a group of people in a room, and often people will talk about products and services and what they think about things. Differently, an in-depth interview is a more controlled setting in which an interviewer will interview some sort of participant who volunteers and does an investigation that's a little bit more intimate and a little bit more one-on-one. Let's go to the next slide. So what types of research are out there? I mentioned qualitative research earlier. Quantitative research, the quantity of things, is a reference toward numerical research. Primarily this regards survey and experiment. And so this is kind of a reductionist form of research. Now, before we confuse that with kind of being some sort of crappier kind of research, what we mean by reductionist is that it reduces the evidence that we have to numbers. Let's face it, we don't walk around every morning and greet each other and say, oh, how are you feeling today? Well, I'm feeling like a 4, or I'm feeling like a 7. Quantitative research is largely steeped in survey and experimental work. And there are other methods as well. But each method really relies on people to answer a few questions. So you might be given a survey and you might be asked on a scale of 1 to 5, how often do you watch Modern Family? Or on a scale of 1 to 5, how often do you play shoot 'em up video games? And so even though you might put 3 or you might put 4, what does that really mean? Does everybody have the same sense of what 4 means on a 1 to 5 scale? Maybe not. We all can agree that maybe 3 is the middle road, and we can agree that 1 is the least likely to agree to some statement, and 5 is the greatest. But it becomes an issue. What people perceive as a 2 versus a 4. And so a lot of this kind of research is predicated on people being able to really evaluate their own perceptions and then put down a number, which is odd and a little bit counterintuitive to the way that we think as human beings. So that's one criticism of quantitative work. Qualitative work, on the other hand, as we began the show with, really gets into the how and why a process works. And so the usefulness of qualitative research really helps shine a light on what's going on in a particular human process. This could very well be, why do you play the PlayStation video game? How do you play the PlayStation video game console? Do you use the PlayStation video game console to watch movies? Why do you watch movies on your PlayStation video game console? And so focus groups really pursue the how and why behind a process. It's also intuitive. This means that really you can present these results just about anyone and they'd get it, they'd understand it. Remember, with qualitative research, we're just looking for themes. And so if I have a focus group result that says, oh, you know, people who play the Xbox One console seem to really like comedy shows. They, for whatever reason, a lot of them have the Comedy Central streaming app. That's easy. That's easy to present. It's easy to pull out quotes from the focus group that support that result. And so when you have something like that, you can show it to entry-level employees all the way up to CEOs, and everybody gets it. When you get into quantitative research, which will be for another time, it gets a little bit heady. Right now, we're in an age of big data. What does that mean? Well, big data is this idea that we are collecting reams and reams of data on people. Right from when you get up in the morning, get off your bed, check your phone, check your email, check your social media, go onto the New York Times website or the Wall Street Journal website or the Economist website, my personal favorite. People are collecting information about us. And I know that might be frightening, but unfortunately nobody reads terms and agreements anymore, and so this is what we're left with. When we sign up for a lot of these social media products and services, we're also signing up for them to be able to excavate our own consumer footprint, as it were. And so because of this, we have tons and tons of data that are regularly being generated. But we don't always know where to look within these big data sets. As a result, qualitative research is still necessary, even though quantitative research methods tend to be a little bit more predictive in nature. Qualitative research helps us understand mysteries that still might persist even after quantitative research is done. For instance, somebody might do a survey and say, oh, for whatever reason, people who watch TBS are really big fans of the Twilight series. But I have no idea based on my survey why that is. One way to further investigate this would be to do a focus group, or 2, or 3, or do a smattering of in-depth interviews. Again, it's this idea ultimately that qualitative research and quantitative research, one isn't better than the other, and frankly, in my personal experience, together is the most optimal way to conduct research. With any research study that anybody does after this lecture, being able to ideally do some sort of qualitative research, be it a few in-depth interviews or a few focus group sessions, and then do a survey or even an experiment if your survey or if your research inquiry calls for it, is incredibly impactful. And merging qualitative and quantitative research really is the optimal way to conduct strong research. Let's go to the next slide. So, qualitative research in the entertainment industry. It's relied heavily on for pilots. Now, we're probably most familiar with TV pilots. It's the first episode that kind of goes onto the air, and we test to see if it will fly in the marketplace. Will enough people see the episode to warrant further episodes? But this is also done with movies. Believe it or not, even after a movie is made and all the millions of dollars have been spent during production, movies are still screened and tested with audiences because studio executives need to know, how do we market this movie? What do people think of this movie? What were the good parts? What were the bad parts? Would they recommend this movie to anybody? Even with video games, this is also the case as well. Video games take a very long time to pilot test because they're constantly being edited and worked on. An average video game can take up to 2 to even 4 years to make. And so there's lots of testing that's going on during the evolution and building of a video game. And so a lot of pilots, especially for television and movies, are typically held in Los Angeles. But content is really tested all over the United States, Baltimore, Boston, even New York City. There's one chapter in a brand management textbook that I once read about running focus groups in New York City, and the author politely stated that New York City participants happen to be heavily opinionated, and so their opinions may not reflect the rest of the country, which I think all of us as New Yorkers can relate to. If you're watching this and you're not a New Yorker, everything you've heard about New Yorkers is true. So why would entertainment firms conduct qualitative research all over the country? Well, it kind of makes sense because everybody has a different kind of cultural baseline. And so people have different tastes and preferences in Los Angeles. It's different in Miami. It's different in New York. It's different in Des Moines, Iowa as well. And so depending upon what producers are aiming for audience-wise, it's important to be able to do these focus groups all over the country. For instance, I've been fortunate enough to work with one TV network in particular, Bravo, and they regularly run focus groups all over the country. If you think of Bravo TV, you know that some of the shows are based in certain cities. They have a lot in Atlanta, they have a lot in New York City, and they have a lot in Los Angeles. Those tend to be 3 really, really big cities. And it makes sense that if a show is being shot in your neck of the woods, you might go ahead and watch it. And so it makes sense to continue to test to make sure that people in New York City are interested in some of the shows that Bravo Television puts out. Let's go to the next slide. In-depth interviews. This is the best way to start this discussion on qualitative research. So an in-depth interview is a longer interview that speaks to individuals one at a time. With any kind of interview, be it focus group, be it in-depth interview, it's really important to have it in a controlled setting. A controlled setting may be anything, including a coffee shop, a library, a quiet place in a park. You really want to be able to control the environment as best as you can. And of course, a conference room is the most optimal place to hold an in-depth interview, or a studio for that matter. But many of us don't have the connections or the resources to be able to hold these in-depth interviews in these places. You're really trying to understand a person's perspective or consumption of an idea, a product, or service. In grad school, for one of my classes, I held in-depth interviews about coffee consumption. Coffee is a very intimate experience. And so people have the kind of coffee that they really like. They're looking forward to it in the morning. They have certain brands that they might gravitate toward. And they have their own opinions about which kinds of coffee blends may offer the most peak experience for them. And so I ran, I think it was about 7 in-depth interviews. And so for each one, I was sitting right across from somebody, kind of like what we're doing right now, and I was able to ask questions, and I asked follow-up questions as well. So if somebody said, oh, you know, I go to Dunkin' Donuts every morning, but my favorite is Starbucks, I might say, well, why would you do that? You know, that might be an example of a follow-up question. A participant who you're interviewing says something interesting, and you ask a follow-up question. That is something to definitely be investigated. Why would somebody go to Dunkin' Donuts every morning, but Starbucks might be their favorite? Could it be because they're with their bratty brother or sister who only likes Dunkin' Donuts and would never go to Starbucks? Possibly. Could it be that there are more Dunkin' Donuts locations in their neighborhood, and so they wind up going to Dunkin' Donuts more than they go to Starbucks? That's also possible as well. When you ask follow-up questions during an interview, it really, really helps you dig deep into what's going on in this process. Let's go to the next slide. Structure of the interview guide. Again, it should explore the how and why behind a process. What's an interview guide? An interview guide is the list of questions that you're going to be asking someone about a process. If you are going to ask somebody a list of questions behind some sort of process that they're involved with, it could be them going to college, or it could be, again, cups of coffee. What you want to do here is you want to make sure that each question starts with a how or why, or has a how or why at the end. So you might say, when you are selecting which coffee to drink in the morning, what goes through your mind? How do you select that particular flavor of coffee? So what I did there is I asked a question that started with when, but the second question was how. You want to make sure that there's a how or why somewhere in the question, because otherwise you're going to have yes/no responses. Do you drink coffee? Yes. Okay, well, that was probably a waste of a question. And you're looking to ask the most amount of questions in the least amount of time. And you want to make sure that you dig deep into what you're looking into. Additionally, you might want to start off with questions that are general. Remember, in an interview guide, you're really, really looking to go from general inquisition to specific inquisition. This means that at first, you just want to get somebody's mind going on a process that you're investigating. And so, if I'm interested in why people watch guilty pleasure TV, it's probably not the first question I'm going to start with. I might ask them, what is a guilty pleasure to you? How do you define guilty pleasure? Do you have any guilty pleasures? Why would you say that these are guilty pleasures? When you are conducting qualitative research, it is really important to prime people to start thinking about a process. So another suggestion here is that the interview probably should be recorded, or you may take notes. I think recording is optimal. You can record with an audio recorder or a video recorder. It's really, really nice because when you rewatch the interview, you might pick up on things that you weren't aware of beforehand. And additionally, it really, really allows you to sit in the moment and to be in the moment when you're interviewing someone. You don't want to be worried about taking notes and looking up, taking notes and looking up, taking notes and looking up. It looks terrible. And so usually with an in-depth interview, you're also looking at the participant's body language. And this is really, really nice. When you're interviewing somebody, you get to see if they're making eye contact with you, if they're giving a sarcastic statement. Yeah, I drink coffee all the time and I'm always jittering like this. I can barely hold the marker when I'm writing on the board to my third graders because I drink so much coffee, or anything like that. And so you get to really pick up on language all the time, body language that is, when you're conducting an in-depth interview. And so even though you're listening for what people are saying, there's way more that's being described. I can say, I like coffee, and I can say, oh my God, I really like coffee. I like hazelnut, but I think French vanilla is really the way to go here. So with all of those pieces of body language that I was offering, the interviewer gets to pick up on more. And so video recording, I would suggest, is probably the best way to go about conducting an in-depth interview. You pick up on everything. Additionally, with an in-depth interview method, as you can imagine, you're not interviewing 100 people. You're not even interviewing 50 people. You're probably not interviewing 30 people either, unless you're in academia. If you're a college professor or a grad student, for an in-depth interview study, you might be interviewing about 30 people. But generally speaking, in industry, you're probably interviewing between 5 to 15 people if the in-depth interview method is your method of choice. You might even do 30, but as you can imagine, it's incredibly time-consuming. And so unless you're a journalist, or unless this is a really special project for some sort of advertising or PR or marketing firm, people usually steer away from in-depth interviews. for the most part, again, because of time. It's also costly. Not costly in the sense of paying people. You might pay an interview subject probably $100 for an hour, which might sound like a lot of money, but for a firm it really isn't. It's really paying the moderator or the interviewer to go from participant to participant to participant. With travel costs, time costs, and paying an interviewer a lot of money, usually doesn't make sense to pursue in-depth interviews. There is another method that is a little bit more popular. Let's go to the next slide. Focus groups. This is really the optimal qualitative method for a lot of marketing, advertising, and PR firms. So a focus group occurs in which you might have 6 to 8 people in a conference room, and you'll have a moderator at the top of the conference table on either side, and they'll be kind of leading a discussion. So the discussion could surround why people watch Netflix, or why people watch Hulu, or why people watch video streaming services. And so the moderator might ask probably 15 to 20 questions or more in an hour or an hour and a half. And so during this time, the goal is to create some sort of group dynamic. And so people are having these great discussions. They're really, really in depth, and you're able to kind of get participants to be comfortable about talking about a particular topic. And as you can imagine, for me, it's fun to talk about TV shows and video games and film. But focus groups are also used to talk to breast cancer survivors and to talk to people who've gone through trauma as well. And so, depending upon the tone of the focus group, you as the moderator have to be very, very careful about what you discuss and how you discuss it. Once again, for me, I'm fortunate to talk about entertainment. And so people are usually really, really excited to discuss it. Let's go to the next slide. Structured versus unstructured focus groups. This also applies to in-depth interviews as well. So a structured focus group interview guide, if you will, really means that the moderator just sticks to the questions. There's no deviation. If somebody says something interesting about a product or service, or one of the reasons why they watch Bravo TV is because they're always thinking about their future, and Bravo TV tends to have older women, older men on it. That's interesting. That's something I'd like to investigate more, and I'd probably ask another question about that to the participant who made the response. However, if I have a structured interview guide setting, it means that I probably wouldn't ask that follow-up question. It's really just sticking to the interview guide. This is why most researchers value unstructured interview guides. An unstructured interview guide says we have questions here, but at the end of the day, we're going to ask whatever questions we deem necessary to kind of dig in deeper, to kind of get a sense of what's going on here, and to really see what's going on when somebody's watching a TV, or what's going on when somebody's watching a movie. And so an unstructured interview guide lets you investigate, and it lets you investigate in a very unfettered, kind of free way. So the goal, even with an unstructured interview, still is being able to ask questions. But somebody says something interesting, you should investigate it. And it might even mean that you skip over some questions. Now, it depends when you're working with a company. If you're working with a Warner Brothers or a Honda or a Toyota or a JVC or a Target, depending upon what their business objectives are in understanding the audience, the consumer themselves, they may want a structured interview guide, or they may want unstructured as well. Unstructured is a little bit more exploratory in nature. And so depending upon what a company may like is how the focus group will be conducted. Let's go to the next slide. So, site of the qualitative research. This is most important. As a moderator, and I've been fortunate to moderate several focus groups, it's really, really crucial to understand your area. Where you're holding the focus group will determine how comfortable people are. It'll determine how the focus group might work. Can people hear you? the appearance as well. If you're in a dingy kind of conference room, people might take the focus group less seriously. They may care less. They may be disinterested as well. The location of the site is also important. You don't want people to get lost. It's the worst thing you could possibly have. Participants are also allowed to stop at any time, and so this is something else to be mindful of. I really haven't had people walk out on my focus group session. I've been able to hold people in there for an hour to an hour and a half, no problem. There might have been one instance, and I think I've run probably 12 focus groups at this time. So it's really not as bad as it sounds, but it is something to be mindful of. Purposeful sampling is also crucial here with a focus group, because you're looking to get people who have watched this particular program before, or who have played this video game or driven this car. So it's important to make sure that you find people that have actually used the product or service that you're interested in investigating. And so that's known as a purposeful sample. It's not randomized, and so you're kind of just pulling people, usually using some sort of survey firm to try to find people who might have good input on whatever you're investigating. Finally, you set the tone as the moderator or interviewer, whichever you prefer. It is your responsibility to come in with a positive attitude. If you're talking about toys and entertainment, laugh, smile, be happy. If you're a researcher who is investigating terminal cancer and you're interested in how people with terminal cancer are dealing with terminal cancer, be somber. Be serious. You set the tone for the focus group. Remember, participants don't know what they're walking into, and it's important for them to feel comfortable. And a moderator who is sure of him or herself and sets the tone immediately and explains everything that's going on will have control of the session. Well, that's all we have for Late Night Learning tonight. Keep laughing and keep learning.